Muy buenas tardes. Mi
Good
nombre es Paolo
afternoon.
Solano.
My name is
Soy
Pablo
director
Solano.
de
I'm
Asuntos
Director
Jurídicos y
of Legal
del SEM,
Affairs
del
for
Mecanismo de
the SEM,
Peticiones
the
de Resolución
mechanism
Relativa a la Ley Ambiental
of
en la Comisión para la Cooperación
Environmental
Ambiental.
Enforcement Rules for Environmental
Les doy la
Cooperation
bienvenida a este
Commission.
seminario
I
sobre
welcome you to
el
this
mecanismo de
seminar on the
peticiones
mechanism of
y
petitions
el
and
justicia ambiental en las
environmental
Américas.
justice in the
Grato
Americas.
esta tarde
We
acompañarnos
have
en
with
tan
us
excelente
this
nivel.
afternoon
Tenemos a los
at an
directores
excellent level,
ejecutivos
executive directors
que se
from
encargan, que tienen
who are in
encargadas
charge or
la
who have the
difícil tarea
task
de instrumentar
and the difficult
estos
task
mecanismos en
of
diferentes regiones
implementing
en
these
América
mechanisms
Central,
in different regions in
Dominicana,
Central
Panamá,
America,
Perú, Colombia.
Dominica
Y bueno, les voy a dar en
Republicana,
este momento
Panama,
la palabra
Colombia,
para que se
and I
presenten.
will allow them to
Solo
introduce
quiero también
themselves in a
dar unas
few
palabras
minutes.
para presentar
I
a
wanted
mis
to say a few
colegas
words to introduce my
Kevin
colleagues,
McCoy y
Ms.
Esteban
McCoy
Salcedo, que
and
son
Esteban
asesores
Salcedo,
jurídicos
who
en la
are the
CECA. Nos
legal
están acompañando
advisors
hoy y
in the
les estamos
CEC.
dando el apoyo necesario
They are
para
providing the necessary support
las preguntas
for
que
the
nos van a
questions
estar
that
realizando quizás más
we
adelante.
are going to be
Bueno, sin
asked
más,
a little bit
le doy
later
la
on.
palabra a mi colega
Without
Jennifer,
further
por favor.
ado, Jennifer, please.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Paolo. Buenas tardes a
Thank you,
todos los que nos
Paulo. Good
acompañan hoy. Mi
afternoon
nombre es
to
Jennifer Vela.
everybody. My name
Soy
is
la nueva
Jennifer Vela.
subdirectora de la
I'm the
Secretaría de
new
Colombia.
Assistant Director for the Secretariat of
Muchas gracias por
Colombia.
acompañarnos.
Thank you very much for being with us today.
Gracias, Paolo y Jennifer, por las palabras.
Thank you, Paolo and Jennifer. Good afternoon.
Soy Jorge Guzmán,
Jorge Guzmán,
coordinador general de la Secretaría
General Coordinator of Environmental Affairs for the
Centroamérica, República Dominicana y los Estados Unidos.
Central America, United States, and República Dominicana
Participación y estamos
in
seguros que esta semana de trabajo
trade.
que estamos teniendo va a dar muchos resultados.
We have many results in exchanging experiences and put into context
Atravesamos
everything that we're going through in the same units in the Americas.
y pues ojalá podamos
And I hope that we can implement these mechanisms with more success. So good afternoon to all.
Saludos a todos.
Greetings
Por
to
acá,
all.
Saida Terrosa, directora
Ms.
ejecutiva
Carranza,
de la
Executive Director
Secretaría
of the
de
Secretariat of the Environment in Panama,
Sean todos
United
bienvenidos.
States.
Gracias
Welcome,
por
and
conectarse con
thank you
nosotros.
for connecting
A
with
mis
us.
colegas también,
My
gracias
colleagues also,
por
thank you
trabajar en conjunto en estos
to
procesos
work
y
jointly in these
esperamos que las
processes.
presentaciones
And
del
we
día de
hope
hoy
that the
sean de
presentations for
provecho
today
para
are
todos ustedes.
a good
Esta introducción
an
de que cada vez
advantage,
más el proceso
and
SEM
that
sea una
the same
herramienta
process
para el
is a
proceso de
tool
justicia ambiental
for
en
the
cada uno de
process of
nuestros
environmental
países.
justice in
Bienvenidos
each one
y
of
no
our
duden
countries.
ir anotando
Welcome,
sus preguntas para el
and
final.
please don't forget to write down your questions so you can ask them at the end.
No, solo quería también
I also wanted to thank to give thanks to Mario Harrison.
Y bueno, me tocan
And
hacer la palabra
now,
a Mario Mancilla.
Mario Mancilla
Nos va a dar una breve
will give us a brief introduction to the mechanism of the petitions in the Americas. This is a mechanism that was inaugurated in the Free Trade Agreement in North America in 1994, and this has been duplicated in several treaties of commercial cooperation and commercial treaties. And we had this coincidence that we have one mechanism and it's identical. It has small differences. And this type of mechanism can be used to share experiences, to share stories, or to share in the different challenges that we have in implementing this mechanism, which is
promover la participación
to promote public participation and transparency in enforcing environmental laws in the Americas. Mario?
Bien, estamos por acá.
Cámara y bueno, te cedo la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, qué gusto saludarlos. Es una lástima
It's
no
a
poder
pleasure
saludarlos en
to
persona,
meet
pero
you. I'm
les
sorry I
mando
can't be in
cariño.
person, but we sent all our love.
La idea de esta
The idea of this small participation is to explore
con antecedentes, con la creación.
Paolo already gave us background of the creation of SEM in the Americas. And it's very interesting because they are born in the process of North America, but they are being installed in all the treaties as a standard measure. So I think that we don't have sufficient research in international trade that explores these mechanisms that increase the level of the citizens. It gives the citizens the possibility of expressing their concerns at an international level. In international law, we have the law of different entities, but the citizens are most of the time like hidden, like the secretariats are creating this environment for the citizens to express their concerns. And I'm going to mention this a little bit later in the tasks that we carried out in a normal basis. And the topic of human rights also, of making emphasis and improving the access to people in general terms as a human right. Because we see it in little by little how the Republican and democratic states require that the people have the possibility, the real possibility, not only formal, the real possibility of going to the corresponding authority and express their rights when they have been threatened or violated. And it has been increased to human rights and access to justice. And the access to justice is going to be specialized, understanding the different topics that people handle. This global process has been identifying. We know that all the citizens are equal and not in material terms or resources. And access to justice has been seen or has been prevented or limited because of procedures that are very complex. And these are very complex issues that take too much time, and that the people don't understand or they don't have the time. And in some of our regions, we have some high indexes of rural areas where we don't have a good presence of administrative authority or judicial authorities. And this means that people have to travel long distances in order to be in contact with the state and with the corresponding authorities regarding the environmental problems that they have. And this is the third element, the cost of justice. The cost is very high, and we're talking about financial costs, and where very large sectors of the country do not have access of just environmental justice. And there's a fear in the region, in some countries more than others, because in environmental issues, the environmental activists, the leaders, can be submitted to threats, to violence, and there have been also very large historical processes that limit the access to information and prevent them from knowing the problems that they're having, and to be successful in submitting their complaints to the corresponding authorities. And it's very different to know the environmental problems that we have with these limitations and these scenarios. And the last scenario that I think that is the environmental secretariats in the region can agree upon. If you have a complaint, it has to go to the litigation, and we don't have too many conflicts that allow the complainant to submit the complaint. And when they can do it with all these barriers, and they have a socio-environmental complaint, it's like a battle. Personalities against personalities, they against us. And the central problem is secondary when it becomes judicial in some of these processes. This is like one part of this process of convincing the people that we have to have access to environmental justice. And since the first secretariat is established in North America, we have been seeing in all the experiments that have been taking place in free trade. For example, in the case of Central America, Jorge can share that the women are the users in the indigenous communities, NGOs, rural communities, and very small number of urban institutions that have access to this type of mechanisms. First, they go with the low cost without creating any conflicts with the authorities, etc., in order to put into the knowledge of the authorities the lack of laws in environmental justice. When we started with these processes in the environmental secretariats, we didn't think too much in terms of access to justice. It wasn't a topic that was present. It was a topic how to ensure the public participation of the citizen and the compliance in environmental justice. But we see as how the two processes coincide, and if we analyze the configuration of the ones that are requesting the assistance and what is the cost and how much time this has represented for them, there's a role of these mechanisms and the processes of environmental justice communication and have access to environmental justice. Since I don't want to stay here, I wanted to establish this brain. And what is interesting here also is to know with these coordinates how it has been handled and how it has facilitated that access to environmental justice by the different secretariats. It's interesting to know the experience of the secretariats of the Americas and what is your perspective with regards to environmental communications? So the question is to interpret a process that was coming from times before with regards to environmental justice. So in order not to talking all the time, I want to ask you just one question in order not to use all your time. Paolo has all the experience and in this process, Paolo. In the context that I just presented, what is the most important contribution of the Secretariat to access to environmental justice? Thank you, Mario. And I think that what you are presenting is very interesting. Besides this exercise of all of us talking about the mechanisms and talk about our differences is correct. There is a topic, and I think that this is a common topic, and I share it from the perspective of the CEC Secretariat. And I'm sure that in the environment of the other regions that also happens, that the most important contribution is transparency to environmental justice in the region. To promote the public participation in the topics of effective enforcement of the law. Many times what happens is that the citizen or the person who is submitting a petition has gone to different mechanisms and different means, and he wants to be heard. He wants for people to pay attention to the topic that he has been working on and he has dedicated effort and time. And the mechanism allows us to look into this topic and to look at the interest of the authorities, the interest of the highest level of authorities through the mechanisms. When you give a response to the parties and through the mechanism, when you have files, then the information is transparent. If somebody asks me, the mechanism is it justice? We can't say that it's our mandate to give justice, but it's a mechanism of environmental justice. And part of this concept and the development of environmental justice is access to information, environmental information. And this is something valuable in these mechanisms. And in the case of our work, is to have the integrity and the mechanism of this mechanism. To implement it the way it is submitted to us in the text of the different treaties.
Bien interesante lo que mencionas.
Very interesting what you are mentioning. When we talk about public participation, like our function is not to administer justice, but to look at all the persons,
de los países tengan acceso al mecanismo y sin embargo
all the countries,
tremendamente diferentes, ¿verdad? O sea, cada país tiene configuraciones.
Every country has configurations. In the Northern Triangle have an era of conflict because it's a way of the way they are organized. But it's a very complex ethnic society, and we have to approach them in a different way. We have to communicate with them in a different way, and they participate in a different way also. Jorge, can you give us how you have been configuring from DR CAFTA? How have you approached this conflict?
Gracias, Mario, por la pregunta.
Thank you, Mario, for the question. It's very interesting how to continue adapting. When we compare these mechanisms, we have every color and flavor. So we have bilateral agreements, we have trilateral agreements, and in the case of CAFTA, we had the Dominican Republic and the United States. And something that for us has been a challenge is to be able to find a way of reaching with our message to the different audiences. Not all the people are interested in listening this message said in the same way. The environmental movement is called one way. The private sector we talk to them in another way. The academia, we also approach them with a different approach. But the idea is to generate an awareness that these citizens' participation mechanisms and the enforcement of the law exist. In Guatemala, for example, we have the challenge, our 24 different Mayan languages and different ways of looking at life and the problems and the urgencies. So to accommodate this message so that they can process it and to understand that the mechanism of citizens' petitions that they have at their service, that this is something that they have at their service, is something that we had to look into. What we have been trying to do is to find people who have credibility and that they are trusted by the different sectors.
Tal vez de uno de los elementos más importantes.
One of the most important submissions is the trust. When they lose trust and they close the doors in order to be able to inform what is being done. So we have been trying to adjust not only the message of the Secretariat by country, but also by audience. So it's always a challenge. We are the first ones in saying that we are guilty. We hope that everybody knows that it exists, but the enforcement of environmental law, we're short. This is a job that has to be carried out. And when we take advantage, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of very recent cases in implementing this mechanism in Central America and República Dominicana. We have two cases so that you can see the examples. And thank you very much for your question, Mario. Yes, something that is surprising in all the region is how these communities, they have a cultural identity very strong. They have a different way of looking at the world, and it's not the same way we see it in the academia, in the government. But it is true, the secretariats, and it establishes a very simple. We see that it is very difficult because they have a vision of the world which is not understandable. and it cannot be translated into the communities that we have to work with. And this is a challenge. And we had to do certain translations in order to have certain tools in order to send a message so that people can really understand the information that we are managing in the Secretariat. And I would like to ask you, in the case of Panama, which also has a very strong indigenous community, what have you done to ensure that translation of the formal language of the mechanism to a form of information so that people can understand you better?
Gracias por la pregunta, Mario. Bueno, en el caso de Panamá, nosotros tenemos...
Thank you for the question, Mario. In Panama, we have 5 major indigenous groups, to put it in a certain way, which speak 7 languages. We have been working on the translation of the mechanism, but as you have said, first, we have to deal with the translation of a chapter in a treaty that contains a lot of diplomatic, technical, and legal vocabulary that is sometimes even complicated to explain in Spanish itself. That is complicated also because it comes from a negotiation process between countries where we have to use a specific placement of verbs, and even diplomatic language is usually very extensive and doesn't tend to be very direct. So we need to make sure that we do not change the sense of what we're after and still comply with our legal provisions. So initially, in this process of translation into indigenous languages, we had conversations with translators from the communities themselves, and we had to understand how they work through this process and even what the learning process is like. So what they said is that usually the translations are not a word-by-word process, but they actually work on interpretation. So certain words even are expressed in full sentences or the other way around. So without a proper literal translation, we had to work on an interpretation of the text that could be then translated into the indigenous languages, all the while keeping that precise sense of what the mechanism requires as described in the treaty. What we did was this joint work with all the translators, and then we had the graphic design work so that we could present an image in a poster, in a leaflet, or in a smaller sort of document with images and a few phrases to describe the process without going into a literal translation of the chapter. Of course, always keeping that reference to the available language and process and where to find the full chapter and the full process on the website or in a specific section somewhere. Also, adding an invitation to hold dissemination meetings within the communities, and in that way, communicate what the process is like in detail and answer their questions, while we also deliver materials in their own languages. To date, I can say that out of those 7 languages, we have completed 4. We have only held about 2 test meetings, to put it in a certain way, but we hope to have that approach, that direct approach with the communities, even for the rest of the year, and see how this can work and have more engagement and participation from the indigenous languages and have them work within the mechanism. Thank you very much. I'd also forgotten to mention that we will have a Q&A segment at the end, so you can send in your questions. We have a few people helping us to provide the best answers possible. Now, let's go back to how Panama is working with people who understand that cosmovision, that world vision of the communities, to whom we have the obligation to approach and bring the mechanism to them. So Jorge has mentioned that we are working through certain organizations that are already legitimate with these users. If someone from a ministry or a legal area, or someone who is completely distant from the community, might not have that trust required. And there are very few of us in the ministries, in the Secretariat, to have that awareness and sensitivity to understand the big differences between our our audiences and communities that we work with. In North America, Paolo and his team have approached the universities. In Central America, Jorge has also set up some relationships with legal firms to guarantee that there is not only an on-site presence, but legitimate presence in communities that have already accepted this presence and this incidence, just to make sure that the information is reliable. So it would appear that the whole process of enabling our mechanisms to provide a proper mechanism for access to environmental justice is actually building networks to identify, to detect these allies, these strategic, reliable partners that allow us to approach the communities and groups that we actually want to get to. So in that sense, I would like to ask Jennifer, who is new to the Colombian office, but Colombia has a huge university organizational tradition. So Jennifer, how do you manage to build these alliances that allow you to expand and multiply the scope and the work of the Secretariat?
Yes, Mario,
Thank you very much, Mario.
acabo de tomar el cargo.
I did actually just come into office, and the universities for us are a very important ally, not only because they help us bring the mechanism to them, but they also become part of those entities that can help the communities make the submissions. So they can be very complex for a person who might not have had access to any sort of legal education, which is what the people who created the system may have. So since I arrived, what we have worked on is a communications plan to make sure that we're well organized and reach not only academia, but the government and the communities with a very clear objective for us to get to where we have to go, with the messages that we need to convey, and also to be very clear in explaining what the mechanism is for. And we've already discussed this amongst ourselves. What is it good for? What is it not for? When is it extremely useful even? In Colombia, we don't really have the same experience as the rest of our colleagues here. We are still in a first exercise. So this practice in approaching governments, in approaching communities and universities is very important for us, and we want to work in a way that is very clear in its objectives so that our communications are also effective. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Now, keeping in mind what our friends from the ministries have shared, we can hear a variety of experiences in how to approach these communities that are not very well connected, that even have a different world vision, and therefore communication with them needs to be different to actually give them access to information. Communities that might even be afraid to participate because they have never had access to these spaces, and when the opportunity shows up, they might not always trust it. So there needs to be an approach through allies and partners that already have a relationship with them. Now, keeping this in mind, as well as other things that they have mentioned, this actually works in terms of contributions, not solutions, however, but contributions when it comes to improving environmental justice enforcement in the region. Now, there might be, of course, simpler procedures. Now, communication is extremely simple in terms of procedures, materials, and requirements. However, this is not easy for a person who has no legal background to write a document that is good enough to make these sort of submissions and make headway in communications in terms of environmental justice. Now, this also lowers costs, lowers the need of people to walk for miles and miles from a community that is just lying passive. And what I could extract from our colleagues' contributions is that there is that focus, that scope of trying to open up communication spaces to work towards enforcement. And now, This eventually would lead to access to environmental justice and to the mechanisms. But it would appear that in the circumstances in which these mechanisms may lead to results, because we also need to be extremely honest with people and tell them what the mechanisms are not for. However, for those that they are useful, it would appear that the mechanisms could provide a significant satisfaction for these users. So that would be a sort of summary, rough summary of what our colleagues have just mentioned regarding our initial comments in this conversation. Please send your questions. You may write them on the chat. And we think mostly of what we've seen, those of us who work out in the field, when we've talked to Mr. Pedro and or Maria, and how long it was to get from one village to the next, or from a town, and how much it cost. But there's another approach, which is very important. What happens when academia sits down to reflect on these things? We usually have no time to reflect in a more thorough, more meditated way and compare them with significant elements from international law or philosophy, etc. But if there's no other comment in this regard, I would like to introduce two of our colleagues from Ottawa University. First, we have Professor Pierre Bélanger. Apologies if I've mispronounced your last names, Professor. And we also have Vinicius de Silva Barreto. Colleagues, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your time and your knowledge. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Afternoon. Thank you very much. Can everyone see my screen?
La presentación.
We have the presentation up on screen. It's
Como yo no tengo muchos minutos,
very clear.
y empezar.
My time is short, so I'll jump right in. Apologies for my Spanish. It's very basic. But if you have questions, feel free to write them in the chat.
Que yo estoy hablando
So to start with, I want to say that I'm live from the Canadian capital, but this is indigenous territory.
Para hablar después de mí, yo voy
Vinicius will follow. I will take up a few minutes. And again, thank you very much for the invite.
Acceso a la justicia.
So, access to justice, vulnerable groups, or people in vulnerable situations. This is the main reason why the platform Justice Americas was created. This is a group that has known each other for quite a while, for many years. But we set up the platform a year ago. Now, as you've mentioned, as a group, we need data. We need a lot more exchange, especially regarding this matter.
Desde el punto
Now,
de mi país,
from my own country's standpoint, Canada, even though this is
no tenemos muchas observaciones u comparación.
that covers the hemisphere, we do not have a lot of points of comparison with what is happening in Latin America. We're a bit closed off in this way, so we can compare access to justice with the United States, with some European countries, but our exchange is very limited. So for a few years now, we have had the chance to have a president of the Canadian Supreme Court of Justice who is an activist, whereas before this position was very traditional. Now, the president of the court is actually very often on the news and the newspapers, discussing topics related to access to environmental justice and access to justice overall. These are things that we know, that we are aware of, but it is very interesting to listen and compare it with all other matters, specifically regarding environmental justice matters. So first, we need to look at complexity and high costs, which is very interesting because we are talking about other mechanisms and other ways to look at justice, so that it's not only within the scope of the courts. And it is very interesting to listen to this from the mouth of the president of the court, of the main court of the country. Then we can talk about insecurity when it comes to justice and the lack of access. A lot of indigenous groups do not have this access, and now in our country there are a lot of people and groups who live in very remote areas, and this is strongly linked to what we are experiencing now in terms of environmental law in my country. We have a lot of people living in these remote areas with very low income levels, and they usually are the ones who are the subject of this lack of access to justice, overall justice and environmental justice. Now we have to look at how to convey the message and look at reforms that facilitate the judicial process and to promote legal services at a low cost. We need to strengthen the processes for legal assistance. So you can imagine that in Canada, of course, having a legal defense is not free. But let's think about a group that has very few resources to pay for this sort of assistance. It is a big issue. And then, of course, we need to look at the transparency and efficiency of the system. These are all matters that we know about, but they have a significant impact and link to Latin America. Let's look simply at all the processes. We have 1,500 mining projects equaling $60 billion. Of course, there is a situation there that links Canada to environmental justice when we are only talking about mining projects, only for this field and their impact in Latin America. So yes, while there is impact, there is also a clash between economics, politics, and environmental law. These are all current topics, but there is a huge barrier as well. And it makes difference between living in a wealthy nation and then looking at exploitation. So this goes even beyond environmental law. Let's look at an example from Ecuador. There are, again, indigenous groups, and you can think about the impact that this has on our indigenous groups. If we make a different assessment with a different approach, for example, looking at surveys that are mandatory for countries who have signed on to Convention 169, whereas we haven't in Canada. However, that previous consultation is mandatory. Then, what happens with human rights activists? We are working with a few governments that are making life very difficult for human rights activists who are trying to defend, as one of my colleagues in the university mentioned, many of the activists that we don't even want to have a coffee with, but they also need to be defended. Precisely because we're not representing a government that is putting activists in jail only for defending those that are more vulnerable. Then we have to look at the degradation of the environment, which is evident. Of course, first we need to look at what is happening locally, but this is actually inter-American. It will lead to forced migration. It will have an environmental impact on the entire region. So, of course, we see an essential need for an inter-American dialogue, which is the main goal of our platform. It is huge, I will admit to that. But then we're also taking small things, taking small steps of what we're doing, even starting last year. We started with a map, maybe not diving straight into a dialogue, but we're working horizontally. Most of our members are academics, but we also have a few activists. Now, for us, it is very important to try to find a different methodology.
Vamos a ver la sociología, la
We will
antropología.
look into sociology, into anthropology, psychology, and if we are talking about legal amendments and reforms, it is impossible to always just look in our own toolbox. We need to look at all the different economic, political pressures and looking at the different vulnerable
Le quiero
groups.
decir, yo olvidé de mencionarlo.
And we also need to mention that it is very complicated for attorneys as well and legal professionals because we are also in our own bubble when we are making these comparisons.
Ahora bien, yo pienso que tome mis
Now,
minutos, pero
please take a few minutes, but I'm just going to mention the other thing with regards to environmental justice. Not only what we're trying to do is to share
parte teórica, y también de
theories, but also to put experts, people who are working in the environmental world, where we have 4 different groups
tratando de
or
defender
trying to defend environmental justice. It was very, very good in the sense of learning things,
interpretación,
interpretation, the way in which the arguments, the new arguments, they are necessary in this environment, because obviously this is a right,
más sofisticado.
more sophisticated right, when we try to see where we have a good interpretation. And this is very nice, in my experience, differently.
Decir que estamos
And the last thing I want to say is that we are also working for many years in Korea, allowing the
derecho humano, derecho
allowing the
ambiental,
students to touch on environmental justice and human rights and vulnerable groups. We're trying to work on this for a few years, and we are going to pass the microphone. I respect my time, and thank you very much.
Pierre.
Thank you very much, Pierre.
Me llamo Vinicius da Silva.
I'm Vinicius da Silva. I'm from Brazil. I live in Ottawa, and I am very happy to accept the invitation to participate here. I apologize for the Portugal, and I introduce myself first. My research is focused on popular participation in justice. Specifically, I'm very interested in the ombudsman program, and it works with the Secretariat because it works with transparency and looking at the judicial mechanisms. And so we work with recommendations, with comments, and also to get close to the complaints and to submit it to the agencies which can litigate. And in Brazil, we have a very strong secretariat. My presentation is in English. I'm going to speak in Spanish in order to give you the possibility of understanding in both languages. So my presentation is basically environmental justice in the Brazilian ombudsman model. And I think that this can also be a way of exchanging experiences in an environment, in a context which is a little bit different from the Brazilian context. And because of the barriers of the language and the cultural differences and many other things. What I want to show you is that this mechanism, the ombudsman mechanism, was created in 2009, and it is linked to public defense, like an institution to access to justice. And public defense exists in many countries. In America, in the United States, it doesn't exist in Colombia. And There are different degrees of implementation and strengthening this institution in Brazil, in Argentina, and Uruguay, Paraguay. These are countries that I know that have access to justice. It's not only criminal, but also in collective matters and not only individual. So what happens is that given the important role of public defenders, for example, in Rio de Janeiro, besides 800 attorneys in public defense, 800 in Sao Paulo, this is a very important structure. So the social movement made this institutional design, and they took care in thinking how these institutions can have access to justice, and it's not captured by corporate interests or economic political interests. So this is why they created this ombudsman. And the best translation to Spanish, I think, is a very translation like somebody who listens. So the ombudsman is somebody who listens, somebody who's there to listen to the complaint. And this is a little bit of difference. The ombudsman, which is different from the Nordic interpretation. So it is published, and there are other institutions, and they take the statements. But this role of it being impartial, of being neutral, is a little bit important in this traditional model. In Brazil, this is not important. The difference is that the civil society, these are community defenders, community associations, social movements with legal background, but people can participate in the election of the person who listens, or the ombudsman. And you don't need to be an attorney. It could be a person from geography, people from history, who has wide information for the mandate of 2 years. So it's 2 years and it's renewable. The social association sends a list. It selects 3 names, then they select one of the 3. This means that this ombudsman is sometimes a person who is an activist, and he's coming from a social movement, and his role is not being impartial or promoting the comments in a research manner. This is somebody who will be representing the interest of vulnerable groups, which are the groups that will be taken care of by the public or the legal secretariat, and to defend their interests. So we are hoping from this institutional ombudsman that has a voice but not vote. In the government, the institution or the board, the administrative board, will take these interests, and they are going to look at the challenges and also the administration or whatever happens with this type of issues, and the public defense. And this is somebody who will be contributing the complaints of the social movements to the public defense. In general, this is the role of the law, translated into English. This is what is expected of this ombudsman or person who listens. So to talk to the civil society is the most important part. This is the summary of this role. I'm going to present a specific case. This is the southmost part of the country of Brazil. It's very close to Paraguay and Argentina. And the capital is Porto Alegre. And in the map, you can see in Porto Alegre, there's a lake, which is very, very large, which is the Laguna de los Patos, or the lake of the ducks. And this is very important for this case.
Entonces, entre
So
mayo y abril de este
between May and April of this year,
más
there were the
de este estado.
the largest floodings of the history of Brazil, and with millions of dollars in damages.
Foto
And this is on the left, you see a photograph of the flooding of the capital, and it was flooded for 3 weeks,
con
and with damages, environmental damages
viviendas
for the people, for the housing, for economy, in a very large scale. On the right, you can see small cities
también fuera
that
afectado.
were also affected. But what happens is, what is important here is that there's a movement by the social society,
Protagonizada por la Defensoría Pública
and these are
a crear o fomentar la creación
promoted
de un fórum
for the creation of a social environmental forum with social movement, with academia, and with the support, the political institutional support of public defense to work environmental issues.
el escuchador de la Defensoría Pública es
The
un
ombudsman is an active member, and he has an important participation. And this participation was important because it created recommendations regarding the recovery, the environmental recovery of the region, reconstruction, and it has to do with a settlement of housing. It has to do with the new industrial
poblaciones indígenas.
companies opening up, and it has to do also with indigenous communities. And these are,
Si fuera enviada a otros
they were sent to the
sistema de justicia para hacer
public justice, and then they had to do a follow-up of these recommendations. There are 16 recommendations. I'm not going to mention them each one, but this is a very important measures.
Y este es un otro caso muy específico.
And this is another specific case, and this is the case of the creation of a landfill. And it's a small city close to the capital, which is called Guaraní, and
Tradicional.
it's a traditional city. And many times our economic consortium
La municipalidad para la
went to the,
sanitario en este territorio.
to the community in order to develop this landfill. So the authorities and the civil association
Se ha juntado contra
got together, and they did manifestations against the creation of this landfill. What is important in this case is that there was an expression between the ombudsman, the academia, which developed a debate regarding the geological and hydric situation with public defenders in order to create a recommendation and to ban the construction of this landfill. And something that is very important is that the public defendant uses 2 units
de litigio
of litigation,
de defensa ambiental.
which is a unit of environmental defense and a unit of ethnic racial agency. We work under the concept of racial.
La propuesta de emprendimientos
And so in Brazil,
industriales
the industrial activities, sanitary activities
que afectan la
that affect
ambiente
the geology, the environment, falls on the
quiere decir
racial communities, for example, the Black communities and the indigenous communities, because historically
poder percibir esta población
groups in power receive this
es una vida
with less power. And so this is racism, institutional racism,
que es estructurante de nuestra
which is structural in our societies in Latin America.
sociedad. Por lo tanto, hay
And
que
therefore, we had to gather these 2 points. We had to gather environmental defense with the publication of the Combat Against Brazil.
Bueno, también se hizo recomendaciones.
We also made recommendations with regards to this creation. And under racial issues, we have the conditions of the National Organization of Labor, so that
consultación previa
so with the prior consultation, we can hear the community. And there's a geological and hydric situation, and also an indigenous situation. And the defense and the previous consultation for the defense of these indigenous communities. And that is what the public defense is doing. And I've concluded my presentation. And thank you very much. And thank you very much. And I can continue with the
Es un gusto poder
presentations.
que tenían para compartir con nosotros.
Thank you for all the information you have to share with us. You know, questions, we can hear all your questions. We will have a session of questions and answers towards the end of the session that we are having. Now, I want to rescue from the interventions or the participations of the presenters. People have to get close to somebody that they can trust, not somebody who can solve the problem, but they can understand the issue, basically, to access to the information in order to understand, and that this person can make a translation and they can accompany them to improve the possibility of defending environmental rights or the rights in general. The role of the Secretariat is always been walking in that path to comply with environmental justice, the good governance, etc. However, our public, we already mentioned this, with the participation of the secretaries of different secretariats is different. Now, we want to present to you the voice of two different users. When we're talking about users, we can say communities, or these are concepts that cannot cover the complexity of the people who have access and come to the Secretariat for the use of this mechanism. First, we're going to present a video. These are small communities or neighborhoods that are old, that were built between the 50s and 70s, and that they responded to a kind of being urbanizing, and now they changed in the 21st century. And then we will present a case of community leaders from the Dominican Republic, the rural Dominican community. So I will ask the colleagues who have the control if we can start with the first video. This first video is the leader of an urban community in the marginal areas in Guatemala. And since the community is surrounded by hills, and these people, this is one of 4 similar cases where we say like colonias, and they're trying to solve the environmental problems. Please, the video.
La colonia, es una colonia que se ubica
We are in a colonia, which is in the zone 18, the Colonia Galilea.
Diversidad de aves, por lo menos 4 especies de loros que están en peligro de
There is also a diversity of birds, at least 4 species, frogs, insects of importance to humans.
Parece que se paró.
It seems that it froze.
Se congeló el video, no sé.
Mi nombre es Tali Mario Roberto Bautista.
My name is Mario Roberto Bautista. I am a lawyer, notary, and musician. I am passionate about the environment. It has been a long fight, but formally since 2018, when requirements are made to the Attorney General's office for the colonia that is surrounded by a ravine for the safety issue, but the slopes of the ravine are contaminated, and therefore the water resources like the Toro Creek, and at the same time the Toro Creek flows into the Motagua River, and this is known internationally because of the topic of contamination. We see certain repercussions are being seen in the health of the population. Really, the space has been tried to be recovered by the neighbors for many years, for more than 14 years, in which people and the neighbors are fighting, and each one has had a role. For example, others are in charge of planting plants, or others make paths in the ravine so that people can go down. A few years ago, an approach was made with the Attorney's General Office, PGN as we know it here.
Que sirven para, me sirven posteriormente para poder hacer la comunicación de la que estamos
These
hablando.
documents help with the communication and activate the mechanism with the Secretariat. The Secretariat came to see firsthand the situation of the ravine. It was found that there is a lack of compliance and environmental non-compliance by the state. And then we make the official submission. It is determined that principles and norms of a constitutional nature are not being abided by. Constitutionally, health must be prioritized, the health of people, and as a consequence, the environment. It is literally a cry for help towards nature, towards the health of the neighbors. What we are asking for are concrete actions, moving away from the written, from a factual record, and into practice. We need systems to treat that waste. How can we take out the garbage, and how can we prevent it from arriving again? We need educational programs as well. We want to recover the green spaces for the community. There has been some progress thanks to the submission and thanks to the efforts made by the Secretariat. There was already a first visit by the Ministry of the Environment. Technical and scientific personnel, and even one of the vice ministers came. As a result of that visit and the pressure they were under, certain steps have now been taken with the community school. A project will start in the second half of the month. And the project is a diploma course. I can't remember the name of it specifically, but it is about environmental education for children and young people who are in school. The idea is to have it replicated with the teachers and parents, and so on with every sector in the community. It is vital to take care of the ravines, to avoid pollution and for our health, and to take care of our bodies of water. We as a society, as regular citizens, we have every right that our laws provide to enforce that right, to demand compliance. And in this way, we can then contribute to the protection of the environment. We can protect our families, the current generations and future generations. So we must make demands. And this is what the CAFTA-DR mechanism enables. We had access to the mechanism and we're already seeing results.
Muchas gracias.
Tal como lo
Thank you
menciona
very
el
much.
peticionario en el video que
As
acaban de ver
we
ustedes,
just saw in the
fueron
video,
14 años para empezar a
it took
encontrar algún tipo de
14
reacción
years to
por
actually
parte
get
del
some sort
gobierno.
of
Como
reaction
lo dice también el
on behalf of the
peticionario, una
government.
cantidad de
As the
en el video solo menciona, solo logramos
submitter
documentar
said,
todas
in
las
the video, we only
denuncias y
managed
información que se
to
mandó a la
document
Procuraduría
all
General
the
de la Nación, pero también
claims
se
and
presentaron ante la
information sent
Municipalidad, Ministerio de Salud,
over
etcétera,
emails, but
etcétera.
they were also
Y a
submitted,
partir de la
well, to the
presentación de
PGN,
la
but they were
comunicación
also
ambiental,
submitted to
genera un
different
espacio
offices
bien
and
interesante en
departments.
el
And of
cual
course,
el
within the
viceministro de
community,
Ambiente
there's
decía
a
que
very
quería
important
conocer el
reaction, like
sitio
from the
y
vice
empezar a
minister who
conversar con
wanted
el
to
pueblo.
visit the area
Podemos
and
poner el
start the
mensaje
dialogue with the
del
citizens.
viceministro de Ambiente, el video
So,
pequeño,
can
por
we
favor.
play the shorter video, please, which is the message from the vice minister?
Estamos aquí en Colonia Galileo de la
We
zona
are here
18.
in
Venimos
the
con nuestro
Galilea
equipo del
neighborhood,
Viceministerio de
the
Recursos
borough in
Naturales y
Zone
Cambio
18. We
Climático,
are from the
dado que
Vice
ha habido una
Ministry of
denuncia de los
Natural
vecinos en
Resources
cuanto
and
a
Climate Change, and
basura
we've seen
que
claims from
termina
the
en el
neighbors
barranco que
regarding all
rodea
the
esta
waste
colonia.
and garbage in
Definitivamente es
the
importante que los
ravine that
vecinos se
surrounds the neighborhood.
organicen, que
It is
ellos
important for
denuncien
the
y que
neighbors
soliciten
to
a sus
get
autoridades
organized,
y
to
nosotros como
see
autoridades estamos acá para acompañarlos,
them
para
make
apoyarlos,
claims to the
para buscar una
authorities, and
solución.
we're here to
Estamos
support them and
acompañados
find
también por
solutions.
personal de la
We are also
municipalidad
joined by
porque al
people
final de
from the
cuentas son las
municipality because
municipalidades
at the
las
end of the
mandadas a
day,
hacer
they
esta
are the ones
gestión
who
de
are in
residuos
charge of
y estamos
managing
dispuestos a trabajar
waste,
con la
and we're
municipalidad,
willing to
con la
work with the
comunidad para buscar
municipality,
una
the
solución.
community as well to find a solution.
Muchas gracias. Entonces,
Thank you.
en el tenor de lo que hemos venido
So,
conversando, esta es
in
una
line
comunidad
with
rural,
our
es una comunidad
conversation,
urbana,
this is
es
an
una
urban
comunidad también
community.
marginal en el
It is
centro
also
de la ciudad
marginal
de Guatemala, es una ciudad
in
bastante grande.
if we look
Y hay
at
algunos
Guatemala
recursos que
City,
esta
which is
gente
quite a large
tiene a
city,
su disposición
and
que
there are
también
certain
los diferencian
resources
de otras
available
comunidades. Como
to
bien
the
dice el
people,
peticionario, él es abogado
unlike others
y en la comunidad hay gente con algunos
in the
estudios, a pesar de
area.
que es una comunidad bastante
There
marginada
is
en el contexto de la
actually
capital de
presence of
Guatemala.
certain people
Pero hay
with a
comunidades que
legal
todavía tienen
background or
retos
education.
mayores. Hay
However,
comunidades rurales,
other
comunidades
communities find even
indígenas,
larger
que les cuesta
challenges. There are
todavía
rural
más llegar
communities or indigenous
a
communities
los
that have
mecanismos que
even a
les
harder
permitan
time
presentar sus preocupaciones
accessing
ambientales, que les
mechanisms
permita
that allow
participar
them to
en este proceso de
submit their
solucionar sus
concerns
problemas
and to
ambientales.
even
En ese caso
participate
queremos
in the process
presentarles
to
el
solve these
caso
environmental
del río Yaque
concerns.
del
Now we
Norte.
want to look
La
at
asociación Green
the
presentó una
Yaque River.
comunicación ambiental.
There
Líderes que
was
quieren
a
compartirnos su mensaje en
submission
este
made by
momento.
the
Por cierto, se miran
Yaque community.
cuadros
And if you look at
grises
these gray
sobre el video,
boxes
si
that appear on
pudiéramos
top of the
esconderlos por ahí.
the
Adelante.
video screen, maybe we can move them, please.
Perfecto, ahí se mira mejor.
Thank you.
Y vivo en una zona donde el río Yaque del Norte, que es el más
I live
principal,
close to the North Yaque River, most important. It touches 5 of the most important provinces of Cibao.
es una fuente de vida.
The river is a life source. It is also an economic source to the government because it produces electric energy. It is also for the agricultural sector, which is prominent in the area of Cibao in the lower Yaque. We have devoted a large part of our efforts on cleaning the river. We have found 4 important issues that need to be tackled. The most dangerous of all is large companies. They throw their chemical waters, they pour these polluted waters into the river. There is also wastewater from housing services, which includes sewage. There are also people who don't care and that throw their solid waste, for example, food waste. My name is Ernesto Hinoa, president of the Grupo Ecológico, Gremuli, which is located in Santiago, Dominican Republic. The group was born on May 10th, 2010. And since then, we have been working on the preservation of the environment. We've carried out thousands of planting operations, but we have also worked on cleaning the rivers. Our colleagues bring us so many reports of environmental crimes throughout the entire country. Now we have found the CAFTA-DR submissions, and we've worked to use the mechanism to file our legal complaints. We want them to be heard. I've seen how truck drivers who are not associated, we call them sand robbers, sand thieves. They come in the night and at dawn, and they don't care. I had a discussion with one of them who was taking sand from the river. They dared me. They told me that the river was not mine, that they had the right, that it had nothing to do with me. Carmen had problems with a video she recorded. She filmed the sand thieves, and that is why she has been threatened. Our colleague, Vito, in San Jose de las Matas, was shot. We have other colleagues in Monción who have made reports of some children, and they were threatened. Some people even shot at their house. And our colleague Francisco was killed. Francisco fought night after night against those sand thieves. He would denounce, he would report, and no one would listen. We have to continue defending our environment. You can count on Gremuli. Gremuli was born to save water for the next generations. My hope is to see everything as it was before, to see the flow of the river, the vegetation, like when I was a child. The Dominican Republic belongs first and foremost to Dominicans. As our logo says, caring for the planet is loving life. That is why we fight for our environment.
Pues como vemos, dos situaciones totalmente diferentes con los colegas de República
Well, we
Dominicana.
can see that we have very different situations. In the DR, they are located up north, closer to Santiago. Others are further away up north. It is more rural. Of course, there are very limited communications, and we actually managed to have that dialogue with them. The signal was awful, and that's also part of justice. How can we have more efficient and timely communications with our authorities? So I'll end on that to open up the Q&A section, and I would ask my dear Betsaida to please lead us in the Q&A section.
Gracias, Mario. Bueno, por acá,
Thank you very much, Mario. So here, the technical team from legal support in the CEC has actually gathered all the questions that have come into the chat. I personally wanted to mention that we, as directors from the secretariats and the ministries, how the CAFTA-DR has worked, taking into account that, as we mentioned at the start of our webinar, we do have very different audiences. The situations in tackling these problems are different. However, we do share are problems in the region. And when we see the bad management of waste, we see how it leads to pollution, especially in our bodies of water, and that is all over in Panama, and as we see in the other submissions, Guatemala, Honduras, DR, and that is a latent concern of the citizens, that we have to give them access to the mechanisms and processes, and we hope these spaces are a chance for the general public to actually have light shed on the situations and see how we can work together with all this information and we can reach certain solutions to these problems. Now, we have questions for our panelists as well, so let's begin.
Sí, se han mencionado a través del webinar.
Right, so through the chat, the complexity has been mentioned often, that there's a complexity in terms of process and legal frameworks. So, how large is that barrier between the mechanism and the general public, and how does this have implications on environmental justice, and how do we manage the implementation of SNAP mechanisms? Thank you, Esteban. Is that addressed to someone in particular, or can we open up to the three panelists? Right, so firstly, maybe our guest from the university in Ottawa could respond. Dr. Pierre or Vinicius, perhaps you would like to answer. What difficulties do you see from your own analyses to have the communities make use of the same mechanisms, which might be more on the legal side, and they can actually have citizen participation?
No sé si Pierre quiere empezar.
Maybe Pierre would like to begin.
No necesariamente.
Sí, bueno.
Not necessarily.
Porque específicamente los mecanismos.
Well, specifically looking at some mechanisms, in my experience, in Brazil, we don't really have the same mechanisms that I'm aware of.
Me parece muy similar.
But I think it is a very similar situation in terms of access to justice with regards to the other mechanisms that fill that role of the ombudsman. So what happens generally is that mechanisms with, for example, the different offices and the ombudsman figure and other stakeholders, even though we know they're not part of the justice system, what we see is that they're frequently located in major cities. So it is necessary to perhaps have a further approach into the interior of our countries to take access to these communities and maybe then teach them about how the mechanisms can help them. So that's essential. Additionally, we have all the other barriers that have been presented by yourselves, starting with access to information and being able to look for the mechanisms and figure out how they work. Thank you, Vinicius. Doctor, would you like to add something? I'm not really an expert in environmental law, even though we're working very closely with many of these groups.
Yo pienso que lo dijimos, pero
I think we've already mentioned this.
Que está todo el derecho.
Beforehand, it was all in the hands of the courts.
Establecer, por eso que necesitamos datos para.
This is why we need data. We need information to exchange, as well as the interpretation of this information, which is actually available in several countries and even regions. That is essential to me. That is actually what would help us communicate this information to other groups, which are working on barriers and also successes. I don't really have that much else to add.
Gracias a nuestros panelistas.
Thank you very much. So, from the experience of the secretariats and the ministries that we share here
on a yearly basis, we can say that a large part of the work that we're doing is trying to bring these processes to the population. Just as Professor Mencia mentioned earlier, we're trying to create partnerships and alliances with the universities and people who have achieved this trust within the communities. And that way also looking for simple language to convey the information in a way that makes it a lot easier for the population to approach us. So we have other questions.
Yo puedo agregar una cosita.
I can add one more thing.
De Guatemala.
We have a question from Guatemala.
Disculpa. Tenemos una pregunta.
Apologies.
De Guatemala.
We have a question from Guatemala.
A los otros.
And I believe that this is for the other secretariats from the other regions.
Darían a la población guatemalteca.
What suggestions would you provide the Guatemalan population from your experience in your own countries? How can they continue to participate and engage?
Bueno, pues voy a aventurar una respuesta.
Right, so I'll try to provide an answer from the standpoint of the North American region, where we see different types of phenomena and situations. So we have shared quite a few things. And I'll start by telling you about a situation we had a few years ago
El Cañón del Sumidero.
in the Sumidero Canyon in the state of Chiapas in Mexico. We received a submission back in 2010
Pues una cantera, una actividad
on a quarry,
allí en el
limestone extraction activity in the canyon inside the national park, Cañón del Sumidero. This submission was filed by the neighbors who lived right next door, and they could hear all the loud banging, as they said, because they were using TNT dynamite in the limestone. That company had set up even back in the 1960s, way before the area was appointed as a national park. So the nature and the complexity in the region itself, where the canyon is located, was also enhanced by the invasion of a lot of people who would just come in and set up camp. There were a lot of irregularities in terms of the land management.
La petición en aquel entonces no prospera porque
So back then, the submission didn't really make any headway because it was very deficient in many aspects. So we closed the submission. Then the applicants came back with a very well-prepared submission. It was taken to the factual record, which was then published. And afterwards, after this publication, as we mentioned, we make all the information public and transparent as far as law enforcement goes. So the applicants take that factual record, they submit it to the Human Rights Commission, and that commission issues a recommendation, after which this triggered a lot of mechanisms in the locality, and that is when the definite closure of the company was determined. So they needed to leave the area, and this is how we looked at the concern of these applicants. So the mechanism is in fact complex. We cannot deny that it is. Even the definition in environmental law needs to be read very carefully. To quote environmental laws is very difficult to actually bring these mechanisms into action. It requires at least some knowledge of the environmental legislation. So I would say that if you find a problem in the communities, try to approach someone to whom at least you can give the documentation. Contact us, approach us. We also provide a lot of dialogues like these ones and some others that are actually more detailed to actually help guide people in terms of how the mechanism works, what it is good for, what it is not for, what they can submit, and what will definitely not work as well as part of the mechanism. So I think the experience that we have built over all these years, we see is becoming replicated in other regions. And I think that the work our colleagues are doing in terms of dissemination, reaching the communities, having these spaces for dialogue, it shows that there is an interest, and it is very internalized. Also, there's an interest in having their concerns channeled correctly and brought to the correct forum. So I think that gives them a form of access to environmental justice with transparency in information. Does anyone have anything to add?
No, creo que lo que mencionas es apropiado, ¿verdad? Sí, la ciudadanía tiene que jugar un papel.
Well, I think that what you mentioned is quite correct. The citizenship needs to take an active role.
The citizens have to have an active role with regards to environmental measures. I always like to say that the deforestation and the species like turtles, they are very interesting, they're good, and they have a great impact. But also to support the state in order to supervise that the environmental laws are complied with. There are cases that can, or there are agencies that can support the citizens to do this. And we have worked on this, and maybe with not with the intensity that we want, but with the academia, with Pierre, maybe, the legal clinics concept, or the kind of free consultation in Bufete Nacional in Guatemala, but to support the people and to identify laws and regulations in order to channel their complaints. Because we have to understand that if the state doesn't know that there's a problem, we cannot say that the state is not complying because they don't know about it. And you already saw the video of the Rio Jackie in Dominican Republic, and we always see the opening that they show some of the role players, government role players, and we hope that next week we can get we can have conversations with Don Ernesto Hinoa and the authorities that just started in the government of the president. So I hope that there are communications and to solve all these issues also. So yes, we have to get involved. There's something to do, and that's all I have to say.
Gracias, chicos.
Thank you, guys. It is important what you mentioned, and like the question that was asked, how can you continue being involved? I would insist to continue. And on behalf of the Secretariat, we will also provide information and support the public with these mechanisms.
Por favor, gracias.
There's another question, Esteban? Thank you. Yes, we have received several questions regarding the SEM process and the case of Escazú. They want to know if there have been any effort for the SEM mechanism with the Escazú plan in different countries, especially with the SEM Escazú, the export of the Escazú products for two countries that are not part of it.
Bueno, pues a ver, ya me agarraron de la bajada, ¿verdad?
Oh, no.
En realidad nosotros trabajamos,
to tell you the truth, we work parallel with the issues of Escazú and the activities that they carry out.
Efectivamente,
Escazú has a very important component with regards to access to environmental justice. That we have to maintain it and continue with it in international issues. And we have to have institutions for that. We are working for more than 30 years in the topic of access to environmental information. So maybe what can happen is that we can share with you the experiences that we have in developing mechanisms towards environmental justice. And access to environmental justice in the frame of the region of the Americas.
Yo lo voy a decir así.
I'm going to say it this way. It's not sufficient just to have the situation of Escazú. We have to have role players. We have to look at these agreements, and that is where we have to work.
A nosotros nos corresponde
We have to develop what we already exist and recognize the parties, the states that are party to,
nos fondean,
and that they finance us and that allow us to respond to the submissions, and they submit information to repair the factual records. And there's an activity, there's an activity of these mechanisms.
No es que nada más
It's not just we
preparamos un expediente de hechos,
develop a factual record and then the parties don't do anything, or they hear you, they hear the petitioners, they hear everybody. But this experience can be very useful to the colleagues who are in Escazú. And it's just to observe a little bit the road and the experience that we have generated from the CAFTA-DR, CAFTA. I think that this is an experience which can be carried out to the implementation for international commitments in the area of access to environmental justice and the defenders of environmental justice.
Sí, me encantaría
Yes,
agregar.
I would love to add.
Sí, gracias, Paola. No, básicamente,
Yes, basically,
como Paola lo menciona,
like Paolo mentioned, our work is parallel, but I would dare say that, like Dr. Mancilla mentioned earlier, that access to public participation can have different tools that would take or contribute to processes to environmental justice. So for the purpose of the public, I think that it is interesting to know that there are different mechanisms through which we can visualize the topics and not to exclude ones and from the others, and that they can be used simultaneously in order to promote access to justice and access to information. Like Paolo mentioned, the work of the secretariats prior to the topic of Escazú for the region is looking for transparency and access to information in the evolution processes, that access to information has been transformed or it has been evolving so that it can be a tool in the process of access to justice. And later, the support groups can support the regulations for Escazú, and these are rules of enforcement for each one of them. And in the same, we will be receiving processes related to national laws developed in the framework of this agreement. And these are tools that maybe can be in the same box, and to develop strategies for to have a better access to justice, to obtain information, and to have an effective enforcement and
Creo que
have access
Belón
to.
tenía una intervención.
Here, do you want to say something?
Contribución, gracias, doctor Mancilla.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a great contribution. Thank you.
No, la única cosa que quiero
The
decir,
only thing that I want to say
profesora,
is the professor in environmental right in Peru
está hablando de
in December talked of Escazú.
los canadienses,
None of the Canadians
que ella está hablando.
know what she was talking about.
Decir lo mismo de la convención.
They say the same of the Inter-American Conference on Human Rights.
Tanto importante de intercambiar justamente
So it is
como
important to exchange,
peticiones, tener la posibilidad
like to have the submissions to be able to
sin tanto
exchange.
el diálogo es súper importante.
And the dialogue is so very important, not so much to exchange. But we still don't have it perfectionized. And this is what I wanted to mention.
que es necesaria de
it is necessary
darse
to get together and
gracias.
thank you.
Ok, ¿tenemos alguna otra pregunta por acá? Sí,
Do
Caitlin,
we have any
gracias.
more questions?
Hemos oído que los
We
procesos
have
SEM
heard
pueden
that the
producir
SEM processes can provide information regarding an environmental situation.
puede
Some of you, or can any of you share an example of what a petitioner has made, a group or a community, what they have done with the results of a SEM process without trying to repeat the case of the Cañón del Sumidero?
Ha habido otros casos en donde
There have been other cases where
mismo,
the mechanism,
y quisiera aquí poner una
and
cosa, ¿no?
maybe
No se trata de judicializar el mecanismo, pero se ha
it's
utilizado
not, we're not trying to make the mechanism judicial, but
y se ha
we have made use of the information that is generated in the process.
se ha hecho uso de información que se genera.
And we have been used the information from the petition, from the information of the Secretariat, and the responses.
Tenemos una
There is
información que está
a
disponible
whole gamut of things that are available for the petitioner. Why? For the submitter. Why? Because we not only generate the information, this is a series of confirmations documented, and with the support of documents, we issue a determination in which we consider that the submission is submitted, and we request a response from the party. That determination includes a confirmation whether it's environmental or not. We make a complete document of what is being submitted. And when they present their response, they will present training of inspectors, programs that they have, resources. There's a series of information and that was generated by the responsible parties. In the case of notification, when we notify and recommend the repair of a factual record, there is another side of information. What we do is to look at the submission, and if we determine here there's an open central part, then we have to have a factual record. This is information that is generated in the framework of the process, and then the factual record. In the case of the Cañón del Sumidero, where the petitioner or the submitter has the factual record and is submitted to the local ombudsman, and the ombudsman uses the factual record to submit a recommendation and to present actions with regards to an amount. In the case of Mexico, with the analytic TVs, and they are generating a large amount of waste. So this took us to the case of two protection processes, and they issued a suspension of this program. There we have had cases, specific cases in which the SEM process generates information. For example, in the case of
arenas bituminosas de Canadá,
the oily sands in Canada, they have been to go to the Canadian government and request their intervention. In the case of the Caguama turtle, the leatherback turtle, and it was published in April, they are asking for direct enforcement for the Navy of Mexico in the Gulf of Rio. It's not only, but it's important that the submitter know how to analyze the information. If they don't know how to analyze the information, it's just left there. So the activity of the submitter has to use the information, is to go to the government and demand that his concerns are looked into.
Bueno, en el caso de
In the case of,
una serie de casos que han
we have had a series of cases which has taken us to decision making, and after publishing a factual record, it's not necessarily the submitter is right. It is important also to understand that a good response from the party is to guide the submitter through the channels or the routes that he should take in order to address his concerns. But we have cases like in the case of Miranda. It's a residential project that was being built in Santa Tecla in El Salvador. And at the end, in the process between the submitter, the chamber of the construction, the municipality, the ombudsman, and the Agency of Human Rights, they understood that many times the citizens or the citizen does not want access to the information. So when they have all the information on the table, they notice that it wasn't necessarily that line of conflict that they should have taken. My colleagues in the case of the Chinamas in El Salvador also submitted for a landfill. They didn't allow the citizens to go in, and what were the technical requirements under which they will grant a permit for that landfill. So the dialogue, and there are many cases, and we have had many cases in which the petitioner, the submitters, have gotten rid of the information.
And
it is to allow that opportunity and that dialogue of having sources of communication in which are valuable.
Gracias, chicos. Sobre el tema de cómo se puede utilizar.
With regards to how we can use this, I want to mention that last year, in a webinar similar to this one, from the Secretariat, we made the effort of requesting the opinion of other submitters have used this process so that they can know how to use the tools or the information which has been collected for the process of communication. And we had an experience where communication was reached for actual record, and it was used by the submitters for different activities of incidents. So we invite you, if you're interested in knowing these cases, to look into the social media of the North American Secretariat. I know that Panama, we have a link for this webinar, or to send us an email, and maybe we can use the same email with what you registered for this webinar. And this way, we see the information that can be useful.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Esteban, gracias.
Sí, tenemos un par de preguntas más, pero antes de hacerlas simplemente quería agradecer.
We do have a couple more questions, but before moving on to that, I wanted to thank the professors, Pierre Belanger and Vinicius da Silva, who had to leave.
No quería perder esta oportunidad.
So I wanted to take this chance to thank them for joining us before they leave the virtual room.
Saludos a todos.
Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Ojalá vamos a vernos otra vez. Muchas gracias.
I hope we get to meet again. Thank you.
Y bueno, tenemos una pregunta.
We have a question. Dr. Mancia mentioned that there are certain limitations in the SEM process. Specifically, what are some of these limitations to the process that the general public should know about? Excellent question. Thank you very much. It's actually so difficult to share so much information in such little time that we ask everyone to visit the website of the secretariats. There are loads of examples and material. The public registry of communications is open to the public, and you can see files of every single case that we have dealt with. So what we haven't mentioned is that these mechanisms do not have the intention of being used as a first tool to file a claim regarding an environmental concern. We are actually supplementary to the tools available in the different countries. So it would be ideal for the citizens to first turn to their environmental authorities as organized, of course, per country. However, the first effort a citizen should make is to approach these authorities. If they cannot provide a satisfactory response, or if the term to provide a satisfactory response has lapsed without a solution, then you can approach us. I think that would be the first limitation. We are not the initial mechanism, nor do we seek to replace those mechanisms. We are supplementary. So if someone brings their submission to us without first going to a government institution, we will probably suspend that submission, which can lead to frustration. That is the first thing. Secondly, Betsaida mentioned that it boils down to the text and language in the treaties and agreements. For example, there is usually a very complicated thing about diplomatic language, which means that they need to provide enough information in their documents to actually give it to actually make it efficient. So we need to look first at problems of enforcement of environmental legislation, meaning there should be an environmental law regulation that provides an obligation that was not fulfilled. And we know that environmental concern or issue not only implies that there is a violation of environmental law. That's the second limitation. The third might be that there is if there is a mechanism that has already worked, and we saw this in a case in El Salvador, the submitter turned to us and told us about their submission that they had previously used a constitutional mechanism that had actually worked. So, of course, that constitutional mechanism would have been the first step and the first tool they should have turned to. We need to make it clear that they can turn to us when there is no other mechanism that works. And finally, and it is very important to keep in mind, is that our secretariats are not courts or legal procedures or mechanisms. So we will not be issuing decrees or mechanisms or sanctions or cautionary measures, because that is not the spirit of the process. The citizen needs to look at the nature of the problem, and if they need something that is a legal mechanism, they would have to look elsewhere.
Gracias, Mario.
Thank you very much, Mario. I know that there's another question left, and we have about 6 minutes before we conclude, so this will be the last question.
La última pregunta es la siguiente.
Our last question is this.
Encuentros entre secretariados de los procesos.
The meetings between the secretariats and sharing specific experiences and these sort of events increase knowledge and visibility. So specifically, how do these meetings link to environmental justice?
Esta no es la, digamos, no es nuestra primera reunión, es la tercera.
This is not our first meeting, actually. This is our third meeting as secretariats.
No es la primera vez que nos vemos.
Nor is this the first time we meet. We have been in contact for quite some time now. Of course, talking virtually and over the phone and so forth.
Recuerdo que inclusive CAFTA-DR realizó una visita.
I even remember that CAFTA-DR visited Montreal back in 2015, I believe. We had very intense days of activities, and that's exactly when we started to exchange and share our experiences in a closer way, and also in sharing our understanding of the treaty under which the mechanism is created. The arrival of Peru, Colombia, and Panama through the understanding of the different trade agreements, which incorporates the mechanism, somehow made the family grow. This is when we said, well, why not hold a meeting? Why not share our notes? And let's look at what you're doing in terms of dissemination And let's look at your understanding, for example, of environmental legislation. What are the considerations?
En el caso nosotros,
for example,
¿cuál ha sido la tendencia?
In our case, we look at the trend over the last few years of how we manage the SEM process. So in our discussions, what has come up is that historically, through our instruments at the CEC, the type of submissions, specifically for Mexico, have related to very restricted issues, mostly related to environmental impact, whereas in Canada and the US, we see a lot more of systemic issues, relating more to species or spelling issues, practices, and something more complex. Over more recent years, we've seen a lot more complex systemic issues coming from Mexico as well, in terms of the enforcement of environmental law. What this tells us is that groups and organizations that work with the environment have actually evolved in their agendas and have developed the complexity of their issues. So only last year, we received a submission on avocado production in Michoacán or tequila and agave production in the state of Jalisco, and the issue of housing development in Valle de Bravo and Manalco, which is extremely complex. And next week, over these few days, we will be performing a site visit regarding the vaquita porpoise, which is also extremely complicated and systemic. In April of this year, we issued the factual record regarding the protection of the loggerhead turtle, which is, again, complex. So what we see is that the development is different in our submissions, which we receive even in the same region in North America. And we also look at what you're doing. When it comes to CAFTA-DR, we look at how things are being documented. There's a lot of contact with the communities. There's a lot of work directly with the communities, but also with the authorities, always with the intention of looking at how to solve these issues. But this is something that we can share as well and learn from these discussions.
Gracias, Paolo.
Thank you very much, Paolo. And so the question was how these meetings lead to environmental justice. And earlier we mentioned how even though our audiences are different and our agreements are independent and we have autonomous organizations, our problems are similar. And information exchange and academic exchange is essential, especially when the staff from the Secretariat is quite small. But we do all have different professionals from the regions that can enrich the work we each do to just make it better. We are 5 minutes away from ending, so I want to thank all our participants and everyone who submitted their questions. I want to thank our panelists, and we want to invite Jennifer Vela from the Secretariat in Colombia to close today's webinar officially.
Muchas gracias, Betsaida, y a todos.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone who joined us today on this call. I think we discussed very significant issues like credibility, transparency. We even discussed what the mechanism is for. We discussed the role of the secretariats and the different states, regardless of their situation and how they play into the mechanism. We talked about practical cases and how to look at the mechanism in action, even trying to understand how it works and what happens after it becomes activated. We want to thank everyone who joined us today for these 2 hours where we discussed different issues, and we want to thank you all again for your patience and your time. We hope it met all your expectations for today, and I want to thank my colleagues. These sessions are extremely interesting. I always learn a lot. I always learn from my peers, and I hope it was the same for you. So thank you, everyone, and Have a great rest of your day.
Y la interpretación, por supuesto.
And of course, thank you to the interpreters, because it always allows us to communicate in two languages at the same time without having anyone excluded. So thank you, everyone. And thank you to the technical team. Thank you very much to the technical team. And of course, they're very important because they make us look good. They do all the hard work behind the scenes, and we look great because of their work. So thank you very much.